Good evening again, George. It's Jesse here once again at the Ivory Tower Collections Game Room, and I welcome you back. Sitting here beside me is your 2600 Junior, and it's done. That's right. So I'll be honest, there were other consoles ahead of your request, but because the Lumacode setup doesn't really take that long to do, and because in the case of your particular 2600 Junior, the refurbishment is not much, because there's not a lot of components on the Juniors that need to be replaced out as compared to the larger consoles. If you've cracked open any of the Juniors yourself, you probably already know this. But let's go over the project in more detail anyway. So when it arrived, the first thing I did, of course, was to visually check it out. And the only thing that I saw wrong was when I removed it. And remember, you might recall that I showed you a video where basically the UPS driver just kind of frisbeed it onto my porch. And the box was in pretty bad shape anyway, so I am going to be using a different box but to ship it back. But anyway, what I did notice was that the power switch was lifted up on one side, almost loose from the console. And that's because one of the tabs that kind of holds these plastic switches in place had snapped. It wasn't completely broken loose, it was just kind of hanging by a thread sort of thing. So what I did to try to help with that was to apply some epoxy around it to try to reinforce it a little bit. The problem is that even though I did that and I let it cure for a full day and it was nice and tight, it didn't want to fit for two reasons. One is because it's a really tight fit anyway to get those pushed into the spots for the little tabs to snap in. They kind of have to push in a little bit in order to pop back out, and that was already compromised to begin with. The second thing is the epoxy, I had to sand and file it down to try to get the area to be more square again so that the switch didn't rub or stick on anything, of course. And in the process of that, it pretty much didn't do a whole lot, because when I went to pop it back in, it simply folded back on me again. So it's on, it's holding, but just be aware of that and just kind of be careful of it. So, you know, I do apologize, but little weird things like this, I guess, happen. If you have replacement 2600 parts, especially for the Junior, then you're free to try to pop that switch out and see if you can pop a replacement in and not have it break. But it's getting brittle on the plastic, and these are about as brittle in some cases as the 7800s are. So anyway, aside from that, the diagnostics checked out great. So I'll go through a real basic diagnostics test cart I use for these. There's not much to it, really. But yeah, aside from that, everything diagnostically tested great. So at that point, I went ahead and replaced and refurbished a few components on it, which again, on this particular model of the 2600 Junior isn't all that much. So you do have, of course, the little baggie to accompany all this. I don't know if you keep any of this stuff or you're probably going to toss it. But of course, the main filter power capacitor gets replaced. I also replaced out the voltage regulator, and I also replaced out the DC power switch. But aside from that, there's only one other capacitor in the whole system. So there's just two little caps. So I'm going to be real honest, I think I hate the fact that I have to use a 2600 refurbishment kit, which has a lot more parts for this, but I just don't feel right charging the full price for that. So I'm only going to charge like a couple of bucks for using some of the components out of the kit. Another thing that's on here is the original RCA jack that was removed, and of course I'll talk about that a little bit more. So aside from that, what else was done? Well, of course, the big star of the show is you have the TIAdigitizer installed, which provides Lumacode output from the console. And I'm sure you already know all this to begin with. You probably have seen some of my posts talking about it, maybe even caught some of my videos that I've made. But Lumacode is a new video output. I wouldn't call it a standard because it's very unique to these digitizers and to what it does. It's basically a composite level video output. So if you were to plug this into something and like into a standard composite video, you will get a very odd looking black and white image of the game screen. It'll have some stripes and some other weird stuff going on, and that's because it is basically a black and white image indicating the luminance values of everything, along with some other data that's embedded within it that is then decoded by the magic of the RGB to HDMI converter box. That converter is powered using a Raspberry Pi Zero at the heart of it to do all of the computational work, but basically it decodes that Lumacode signal, overlays a color map on top of the image based on the luminance values that it gets from that signal, and then it outputs as a brand new fully digital HDMI image. And it looks amazing. And it does all that with very, very low lag, like 4 milliseconds or less in most cases. Now, in the case of the 2600, and I'll get into this a little bit more, there's two modes that you can use on this. One is the fast mode, which is like the super low latency mode, the 4 milliseconds or less. Another one, and the mode that you're probably going to have to use the most, is the one that compensates for the weird 2600 games that don't use proper scanline counts and they have a tendency to blank out on other AV upgrades. Well, this combats that a little bit by sort of adding a generation or what they call a gen lock buffer into it, where it disables the gen lock in this case, and that allows the RGB to HDMI to essentially buffer the image output to compensate. But that does mean that it adds a little bit of lag. I've been told it's somewhere between 6 to 10 milliseconds total, and because it's variable, sometimes it's noticeable. I'll be honest, I haven't noticed it, and neither have like the two other people that have this installed. So I think it's going to be very much your mileage may vary, or unless you're just super perceptible to it, you may not even notice this. But I have to mention it all the same. So the digitizer's been installed, and the output from that has been ran to a new 3.5mm style audio jack that I installed in place of the RF modulator. In this case, I removed the RCA jack from the RF output section because it was in like a little U-shaped frame that was soldered onto the main board. So I just kind of wiggle it out, break it, and pop the RCA jack out, and then install the new 3.5mm jack in its place. And that provides for a fairly stock look to the console without having to do any case shell modification in this case. The Junior is really the only Atari I can do that with because of how it's designed. So, awesome. But how does all this get used again? Well, again, it's through the magic of the RGB to HDMI. And in this particular case, you will be getting one of my starter kits with this. And the starter kit will include the following components. It includes the main RGB to HDMI converter box itself. Yes, it's not very big. I mean, here's my hand, and here's the entire box. So it's a fairly small box. I'd say it measures, I don't know, maybe 3 inches across by about 1 inch tall, and about 1.5 inches wide or so. So it's not very big at all. And it's got 4 buttons on the front that I will talk about real briefly. They are labeled as SW1, SW2, SW3, and the button up here to the far right center is labeled RST, and that is a reset button, which by definition, if you push that, it basically does a soft power cycle on the RGB to HDMI, essentially rebooting it. There's not going to be too much of a need to have to do that, but the button's there just in case. The SW1, SW2, and SW3 buttons are the ones that you might interact with the most. SW1, which is the very first button here, acts as both a menu button to bring up the initial on-screen menu, which I'll show you in a little bit, and it also acts as like an enter or select button. So once you've got an option that you want to change and you've got it on the option you want, then chances are you'll hit this button to either change that selection or to accept it and enter it. And also, once you want to back out to different menus, you go up to like a return or like a back type option, and you would use, again, SW1 to confirm it as like an enter or a select key. The SW2 and SW3 buttons are navigation buttons to move up and down among the menu and to also cycle between different options if there are any to select from on different areas. Again, I'm not going to go into every single little menu option on the RGB to HDMI because you really won't need to do that, or at least you shouldn't have to. I'll just cover the basic ones that might be required for you. Okay, so you've got the box. What else? Well, the box has to have a method to connect to the console. So I'm also going to be providing like this this braided 3.5 to 3.5mm audio patch cable. So the way this works is pretty simple. You just plug one end of this cable into the side of the RGB to HDMI because it's got a little headphone jack inside of a big opening on one side. And then the other end of the cable, right here, plugs into the back of the Atari. And that's the only cable connection between the Atari to this, is just this one cable. The rest of the cables that are necessary attach to the RGB to HDMI. So what else do we need? Well, the RGB to HDMI does require power. It doesn't run on magic. So how does it get its power? Well, it has 2 micro USB ports on this one side of it here. The one that's on the right, closest to the edge of the case shell, is pretty much a dedicated USB port or a micro USB port, and then the one next to it can be either power and or data. So as a result, I will also be including this braided cable here, which is a micro USB to USB type A on the other end. And pretty simple, really. You just take the micro USB into this cable, make sure I'm lining it up right, and just plug it into the rightmost USB port like that. The other end, you would then plug into either like a 5 volt, 1 amp or so phone charger or tablet charger, or what I've been doing, and as I'll show you in this video, I actually plug it off the USB port on my TV and it works fine. I also do the same thing up in the lab. So you can use a dedicated power supply like a phone charger if you want to, but it might be just as easy to just connect it off your TV since it's kind of all there. And that way, when you turn on your TV, this would also power up and be ready to go. Okay, great. So now you got this. Well, now what? Well, you got to be able to see the output, right? So you've got the console connected, you got power to it, but how are you going to see the results of the output? Well, the RGB to HDMI has a mini HDMI port right here. So again, as a result, I will be including a mini HDMI to full HDMI adapter cable. It's another little braided cable. They do make smaller adapters and like hard plastic adapters that are, you know, solid, but I prefer the flexibility of this because it gives you more room to move things around and kind of align and put things where you need to. But you just plug that in to the mini HDMI port, plug the other end into an HDMI cable, and you're off to the races. That's pretty much it. So yeah, you do have a little bit of extra, you know, cable and stuff to deal with here, but I try to provide long enough cables that you can probably put this out of the way somewhere and out of sight, and it's small enough that it's really not going to get in the way. And you won't have to interact with the buttons too much unless you're going to be using multiple consoles with this in the future, in which case you would want this box to be a little more accessible so that you can change the profiles as needed. So those are the items I'm going to be including. One other thing that's included is there's a little piece of yellow tape coming off on the opposite end here. That is attached to a micro SD card, and that micro SD card contains the boot system and software necessary for the RGB to HDMI to operate. So I also provide that already preloaded, ready to go. Again, that actually plugs into the Raspberry Pi side of it to handle the operating system operations. And that's pretty much it. So the items that I'm not including is an HDMI cable because, I mean, I figure at this point in time, everybody's got a spare HDMI cable laying around. And so I'm sure you've got one, and just, you know, whatever you want to use for that should be fine. And again, I'm not going to be providing an actual power source, just a cable to be able to use. Because, you know, micro USB is not common as much anymore as it used to be. In fact, I'm starting to have a hard time finding some of these cables. And so as a result, that's why I'm fine with providing a cable to power this with that will work. But as far as power supplies go, like I said, I figure everybody's got some way to already do that. So I don't really want to force an extra cost or an expense that they don't need. And that's pretty much it. So that's what will be coming with it. There is one more cable that will come with this, but it's not a cable you're probably going to need, at least not right now. And that's because every one of the RGB to HDMI converters that is designed for Lumacode comes with this additional cable here. It's a very short, small 3.5 millimeter to RCA breakout cable. And I'm going to still include this because it comes with the RGB to HDMI converter when I buy them. But again, this isn't something you're going to need immediately. However, this would be handy in the future if you have other consoles upgraded with Lumacode, and if you have those consoles use RCA jacks instead of a 3.5 millimeter. Then you would be able to use this cable to connect the console to the RGB to HDMI that way. So again, it'll be in the box. You'll probably not need it, but just kind of good to have. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I know you're excited about this. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to turn my camera around, point it at the TV. You've seen this before. You know the routine. I'm going to first go over some basic menu functions on the RGB to HDMI converter itself so that you can kind of see that. And then I'll fire up your 2600 through the new Lumacode output, and you'll be able to see it in glorious HDMI. So with that, George, I'll be right back. Okay, George, I've got my camera now pointed at my modern TV here in the game room. And again, we're going to start by going through essentially a crash course on how to use the RGB to HDMI. So I have everything connected up using your exact RGB to HDMI and cabling that I'm going to be providing you. Just so, again, you can see that everything you're going to be getting is what I am using here in this demo video, and everything is working. So again, I have everything connected. The first thing I'm going to do is hit the reset button just so you can kind of see what everything looks like when it starts up. There's really not much to look at. It's going to remain black until it finally comes up showing me what the current resolution output is, which in this case it does detect 1920 by 1080. Now, by default, I do have the RGB to HDMI set to auto for the resolution. That's because it's designed to read the EDID information on your display, or the display that it's connected to kind of determine what the best output resolution might be based on what hardware is installed. So let me go through the menu real quick. I'm going to hit SW1. That's going to bring up the main menu screen. Now, all of the different menus that we go into are going to look basically like this, with it telling you at the top what menu option you're looking at, and all of them will feature a return option at the top, which by the name, by the way it sounds, will return you back a menu screen. So basically it's like your back button. If you're on the main menu and you hit the return button, or you select the return option by hitting SW1, it exits back out of the menu and you're ready to play your game. So again, I'm hitting SW1 to access the on-screen menu, and then I'm going to use the SW3 and SW2 buttons to move up and down through the different selections, as you can see here. So the first one I want to talk to you about is the select profile option. Now right now you're not going to have a real use for this because you only have just the 2600, but when you get some other consoles upgraded with Lumacode, as I believe you're planning to do, then you will be going to this option so that you can change the profile of the RGB to HDMI to match the console you're going to be using. Right now you'll see right where it says profile, it says we are on Atari 2600 Lumacode, no gen. That means no gen lock, which is the mode I prefer to use because that's the one that gives me the most stable picture across all of the different 2600 games. But let me show you how we can change the profile. So you can go to Select Profile, use the SW1 button as an Enter key, and now we're in the Select Profile menu. From here, I use the SW2 and SW3 keys to navigate to different consoles and computers. There are a lot of systems that support Lumacode, as you can see. There's the one for the NES, which you might be interested in. There's one for the Master System. There's the one for the Intellivision, etc. There's also one here that just specifically says consoles, and I believe if we take a look at it, it just has a separate RGB setup for the NES. That's not what's going to be used here, but again, I'm just providing you the files as I see them. There's the one for the ColecoVision. And now if you go into the one for the Atari, this will have the ones listed for the 2600, the 5200, and the 8-bit computer line. Now you'll notice that the 7800 is not on there. That's because that profile is not ready to go and it's not officially released. When it does, I'm sure there'll be a file update and a software update for all of this. But for right now, we want to go to Atari, and let's say I was changing it to a 5200. I would choose Atari 5200. The whole system will change, and now I have a new menu. And you'll notice that it completely changed the font style. What's going on with that? Well, the actual menu screen will change its resolution and font styling to match the console that you have selected. The 5200 can do higher resolution output than the 2600, so as a result, the actual font style looks different and looks a little higher resolution. Okay, well I want to go back to the Atari, so I'm going to go all the way back down here to Select Profile again. I'm going to hit SW1. Now this time what I can do is, instead of going back to Atari and selecting it, I can go to this option down here at the bottom that says Recently Used, and then this is going to allow me to switch between different profiles that I may have used recently. In this case, I was only just using 2600, but then it noticed that I selected 5200, so it added that to the list. But I'm just going to go to 2600 Lumacode, no gen lock. Everything's going to change again, and we're back to the way it looked before. Okay? So that's how you select different profiles to change between different consoles. Pretty easy. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Preferences menu. Now, the only thing that you might want to mess with here is there is a scan line option that you can turn on and off. You can also use some different levels of those scan lines. That's not a feature I particularly like to use, but that's where it is. But the option you might want to mess with is the 16:9 integer scaling. By default, all of these come set to enhanced 4:3. Now, if I hit the SW1 key to select on that, it now moves the cursor selector to enhanced 4:3, and now when I use the SW1 and SW3 buttons, it will change between some different scaling modes. Now, I don't have an image on the screen for you to see what this does, and in the case of the 2600 on my TV, none of these really change the output. But what these will do is full width, for instance, I happen to use on the Intellivision. That's the one that gives me full borders with the image essentially mostly 4:3. It's still a little stretched more than I'd like, but that's the mode I use for that. Exact 4:3 will actually shrink things in a little bit to an exact perfect pixel square 4:3 output, but that doesn't look quite right. It might look a little too narrow. So the enhanced 4:3 is like the medium of between both of those. And again, that's pretty much the one I use as a default. Once I have it on the option I want, I hit SW1 again. That brings me back to these menu options right here. And then I can go back up to return, hit SW1 again to go back to the main menu screen. So that's something you might mess with in the preferences menu. Another thing you might want to mess with, and I'll actually demonstrate this a little bit later, is the geometry menu. Specifically, you might find that you have to play with the vertical offset option. The vertical offset and the horizontal offset, by the way they're named, will shift the picture left and right if you use horizontal and up and down if you use the vertical. And again, the reason why you're going to want to know about this is because different TVs and different resolutions might change the alignment of how the picture is on the screen. So you might have to use these offsets to adjust it and center it best for what you like. The last thing I'm going to go into is called the sampling menu. Now there's two ways to access this. There's the easy way and there's the more complicated way, which I'm showing you right now. So the sampling menu, if I go ahead and select on that, the only option we're concerned with here in the case of the 2600 is the sampling phase. Now, all of the consoles will end up using a slightly different sampling phase from each other. And what you'll find is that depending on the HDMI cable you're using, how long that cable might be, or how short that cable might be, or just your TV in general, the sampling phase might need to be adjusted. I'm going to do something on purpose to demonstrate why we would need to change this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to purposely change to the wrong phase for the 2600, just to show you an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so let me go ahead and power on your 2600. I'm turning down the volume a little bit. And we're going to see it output through HDMI, but it's not going to look quite right. There we go. So we're looking at it, and we're outputting HDMI, but you'll see that there's all this weird speckly garbage going on. What is that? Well, that's that phase sampling I was telling you about. And there's two reasons, again, why this can happen. One is that because of cable lengths or the way your TV is interpreting the signal, it just doesn't quite like it. So this is a situation where you might have to go into the sampling menu, go down to the sampling phase, and you might have to adjust it. Now, I believe this was on 5 originally, so let me just go back and set it to 5. And then I'm going to hit return, and hit return again, and now we have a perfect HDMI output image. Awesome. But let me show you another way we can do this. This is the way that you'll probably want to try first, just because it's a little easier. So I'm going to purposely mess up that phase again. There we are, it's all messed up. Now the RGB to HDMI features an easy way to try to adjust the phase, but this is only going to work if you're on a static screen. So if you have a game running that's got motion going on, this isn't going to work very well because the motion is going to confuse it. But it has an auto calibration mode for the phasing. And to access this, all you have to do is push and hold the SW3 button, and it will go into auto calibration mode. And what it's doing is it's checking each of the sample phase modes, and then what it does is it comes up and it determines which one had the best overall output option, and then it lets you save it on that option. Just like that. So you saw that it was able to fix itself in this particular case. So what is the other situation I was talking about where you might have to use the offsets? Well, let me put in my Harmony cartridge. Because the Harmony menu is a little weird. Because of the video mode it uses, notice that part of the word harmony is completely cut off. Well, this is an example of where you might have to make an adjustment. So let me go into the menu. In this case, I'm going to go into the geometry menu again, and I'm going to go into the vertical offset. Again, vertical is up and down. So I'm going to hit SW1 to select that I want to change that. And because I need to bring this down, I'm going to need to lower this number. So I'm hitting SW3 to lower it. And I believe, there we go. So it looks like about a setting of, so in my particular case, I'm going to put it at about 30. And then when I hit return and hit return again, now I can see the full word harmony, and I can still see ROMs at the bottom, which was the last option. So again, in this particular case, I did have to adjust my screen a little bit in order for the harmony menu to fully populate and be viewable. So again, this is just something you might have to run into where you might have to make little changes like this. Okay, now, let's say you've got all these changes in place, you're happy with the way everything looks, but you don't want to have to make these adjustments every time, right? Of course not. Well, go into SW1, go into the main menu, and almost in the center of the options, you have this option that says Save Configuration. So if you have that one selected and you hit SW1, it will now save all of the settings that have been configured on the RGB to HDMI into the profile that you currently have selected. So now all of these settings I just did are now saved as part of the new 2600 Lumacode profile. So the next time I go to select the Atari and I actually go and I switch to that profile, all these little adjustments will already be done and in place, and I won't have to go through them again. So I'm showing you these options, and you may or may not have to mess with them, but if you do, at least you know that it's not something you have to do every time, because once you've got it dialed in to the way you like it and prefer, you can save it and then carry on. Okay, so obviously you know the console's working, but let's go back into the test cartridge. So again, it is perfectly audible. You can hear it. Okay, I'm going to turn it back down. And then here we are on the controller and switch screen. So here is my controller in port 1, and the fire button is working great for that. Here's my other controller in port 2, and that is also working. And then additional, we can check the black and white color switch. So there it is in color and black and white, so that's working properly. There is the select button working. There's the reset button working. And then we have the difficulty switches. Currently I have player 1 apparently in position A, now it's in position B. And then player 2 is currently in position B, and I can switch to A as well on that. And then the last thing to check involves these little guys down here. What the heck are those? Well, that requires me to unplug the controllers for a second that I was using and plug in something else. Paddles, that's right, the paddle controllers. Now my paddles are really jittery, but it's good enough for at least to make sure that the paddle lines are reading. So there's player 1, and the fire button's working for that. And then if I grab it for player 2, that's also working. And then if I move over to the other side, once again, there's player 3 and player 4. So all the paddle lines on the TIA are registering properly, which is good, because this is really the only way to check them and verify. All right, that's enough of that. Let's take a look at some more fun stuff, shall we? Now I'm going to use my Uno cartridge, just because it's got everything I need to show and test on it. Here we are. Now I want to show you one thing really quick. While the RGB to HDMI is while the digitizer for the 2600 is considered to be done and ready, it does have at least one flaw that I have found with one particular game, and I'm going to show you that right now. The Frogger version, or the supercharger version of Frogger for the 2600, has a very slight issue that I want to show you. Another problem that exists, and you can actually see it on the screen, has to do with the spacing of the lettering on some flash cartridges. As an example, notice that the word star path, how the A and the R are bunched together, and the large amount of spacing we have between the T and the H. It's not really supposed to look like that. So these are some minor rendering errors that are caused by the Lumacode, which so far Copper Dragon hasn't been able to get sussed out. But at least I can tell you that that only affects these menu screens that I've seen, and with the exception of the game Frogger, which I'm about to show you, all the other games I've tried and tested looked great and didn't have any issues. So let me show you what happens with Frogger. And by the way, it's still playable, but take a look at the logs. See anything wrong? They're missing their centers. It looks like there's a big letter E in there. Even more entertaining is that it does let you go there. It's just not rendering it properly. So apparently the way they coded the graphics on this game is using a little bit of a weird setup that he hasn't been able to quite get figured out yet. So I just wanted to show you this. Again, this is not a game-breaking thing, and this is the only game I've seen so far that has this. In fact, I was the one that reported the issue, and nobody else had even reported it yet, even though this had been out for several months already. So even his testers didn't catch it. I guess I was the first person to try Supercharger Frogger. Let's try something else. Let's see. Let's take a look at, oh, I know. Let's take a look at Casey's Gold, one of the newest games to be released recently. And I got to tell you, it looks really great on this system. So here we are, the title screen to Casey's Gold. Let's play a little bit of Casey's Gold real quick. This output just blows my mind. It's really difficult for me to want to play the Atari on anything else other than my Lumacode setups, because it just looks so good. Okay. Let's play some Hero. So awesome. Well, George, there you go. Your 2600 Junior. It is ready to play some games for sure. So yeah, this is a very impressive upgrade, as you can see, and of course you'll have to see it for yourself. And that won't be very long, because what is the plan from here? It is currently Friday night, so I'm going to try to get this video edited up tonight if possible and get it uploaded to my YouTube channel. Again, it will be unlisted initially for your privacy, but you can share the URL with anyone you wish. I will then get an email sent out to you with a link to the video in addition to the pictures that I've taken of this project. There's really not too many pictures that need to be taken with the 2600 Junior, but still, I'm going to show you what it looks like on the inside. I know you've already kind of had a peek a little bit with a picture I sent before, or a couple of days ago, I guess it was, as a teaser. But then I'm going to get it all boxed up and get it ready to send it back out your way very soon. Now again, I'm going to be using a different box because the original box was pretty crushed up in some places, and because I have the additional hardware I have to send with the RGB to HDMI, it wasn't really going to fit in the original box that you sent. That's through no fault of your own, of course. It's just, you know, there is additional hardware and equipment that's got to be used. And by the way, I wanted to show you, I was using an Epix 500XJ in your controller test screen. So, yeah, that's right. They're good controllers. I like them. I've got several of them, in fact. But with that, George, I thank you again, and I guess I will await to hear from you on the next project, whenever that might be. So I hope you have a good rest of your weekend. Be on the lookout for those emails, especially the last one, which will have the tracking information, as well as the invoice with the final remaining amount that is owed. And I'll catch you another time. Thanks.